Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about Ukraine. It is one of my favorite countries, so hopefully it'll be a very fun show.
For the history side of things, we're going to stick more to Kiev, which for people that don't know, when you're outside of Kiev, I think, and you're outside of Ukraine, people say Kiev. But if you're in Kiev, you say Kiev because that is what they call themselves or their own city. And so we're going to focus on Kiev, but we'll probably call it Kiev a bunch just because we're talking about it there.
I'll probably just call it Kiev.
Yeah.
So
I go back and forth.
Of, like, habit.
Like, yeah. I think it's one of those things where it's like I'm in Sofia, Bulgaria right now. And when I'm here, I say Sofia, which is what Bulgarians say. But then when I'm talking to someone else, I say Sofia because they don't know what Sofia is. Like, that sounds like a sofa. So
it's totally true. Yeah.
So we're going to focus on Kiev, but then when we talk about travel, because Megan's got such a great grasp on the entire Ukraine travel scene, we're going to do some travel tips from a bigger area. So let's start with talking about what was Kiev like on the eve of the 20th century, before World War II, before World War I, before the famines. What was it like to be in Kiev?
Well, it's a very historical and old city. The problem is I think it's never really had its own identity. It's always been part of this or part of that. When you look at the architecture there or the culture there, you can definitely feel that it's never had that solid identity. Yeah, it's been, kind of taken over by all kinds of different people. It's about 1,400 years old, and it's in a very desirable location right on the Dnieper. So it's just, come and gone from different places, and it's never really had a grasp of its own identity until very recent years. Hence why we hear about it in the news a lot, is they're coming into their own a little bit. Its first independence, I guess, from the time that we're talking about was in 1917. So anything before that, it was, under Russian Empire and, desirable by the Polish Empire. It was just, back and forth. But I would say, like, the history that I really am familiar with started in like the early 19th or 1900s. So maybe like 1917-ish when it became independent.
So when you say that it was desired by the Polish, I have a feeling that not everybody, but a lot of people don't know where Ukraine actually is. So you want to tell us what are the countries that border Ukraine?
Okay, so Ukraine is actually a very, very large country. I don't think people realize it does take like 20 hours plus to get across it by a train. But it is surrounded by Russia. It's surrounded by Poland. Moldova is in there somewhere. And then the breakaway territory of Transnistria. Belarus is north of it. So it's surrounded by these like other mammoth countries for the most part, minus Moldova. But it is situated right there. And it is a very interesting place, like geographically, because it is kind of the heart of Europe. But it also takes on, when you go to eastern Ukraine, it feels completely different from a landscape standpoint than it does maybe in the West, where you have the Carpathians and it's very European looking. So it sits at a very interesting hub. And because of the size of it, it has just been kind of involved in everything that's been around it for centuries.
So what does it look like in 1917? Why does it become independent?
It becomes independent from, I guess, the Russians over the time, but it does not stay independent for very long. It was a very interesting place, and it was kind of this, like a city of aviation, in the early 1900s. It was just it had a lot of progress, and it had a lot of like economical opportunity and potential. So in 1917, it did become independent. so briefly. I mean, not even like maybe 5 years, and then it went back into being taken over by the Soviets. So it was kind of like at the height of all those countries that were celebrating their 100-year independence this past year. It was one of them. But like not a lot of people know about that outside of that part of the world, because it was taken back over pretty quickly and went under Soviet occupation.
So once it's under Soviet occupation, I think the things that I was most familiar with about Ukrainian history were the famines. But I know that was more of a rural phenomenon. What was it like to be in Kiev during that time? And was any of that targeted at the cities?
Well, interestingly enough, the capital had moved from Kiev to Kharkiv in, I think, like 1922-ish, when it became Soviet. So they actually moved all of the main operations of the country, the Soviet state, over to Kharkiv. It wasn't until right after the famine, which was like in the early 30s, where Kiev became capital again. And I mean, like this is obviously a bit controversial, but I think that there is a definitive proof there that this was a man-made famine. This was not something that was happened by accident. And it's, if you research it well enough, you'll find out like the 4 million plus people that perished during it. It was kind of just something that was Stalin made in a way, or through his regime was made. And it was really, really, really important part of Ukrainian history. And you can sense it even in the current, or even in the younger generations, you can still sense that part of history, even if it's not quite as tangible as some of the newer stuff.
So when you say that it was man-made, can you describe a little bit of some of the things that were done to the Ukrainian population by the Soviet occupiers?
Yeah, so basically, and it's really funny, there's a movie that came out about this, and I have not seen it yet because I think they glamorized it a little bit with like the love story.
Wait, a movie came out in Ukraine?
No, it's American made. I think it came out last year. It's called Bitter Harvest.
Oh, okay. I'll check that out.
Yeah, and I think I haven't watched it because when I saw the trailer, it was a little bit more glamorized with like a love story and stuff. And I know that you kind of need that to get people to sympathize or to understand things, but I just haven't had the time to even check it out. But it's so Ukraine is a rural and agricultural country, and there were a lot of talks that there was going to be a Ukrainian independence movement during this time. So in order to kind of weaken the country, or the Soviet state, really, to weaken it, it was said that Stalin basically put massive food rations on things in order to kind of break down the country a little. And this apparently has happened in Kazakhstan too, but I'm not as familiar with that famine, but it happened at the same time. But it ended up resulting in about 4 million people. And they say maybe upwards of like 7 million ended up dying as a result of it. So it's something that's very sensitive in Ukrainian culture today. And I mean, there is no actual proof that it was a man-made famine, but all of the signs point the right way. And given the history of what's happened in that part of the world, I don't doubt it. So it's now recognized as a genocide by a lot of countries.
So because what was happening was they were growing food and they were shipping it out. The farms had been taken over and collectivized. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't. Yep. So, okay. So when I was in Cambodia and looking at what the Khmer Rouge did, every time they would talk about what they were doing, it just sounded so much like what had happened in Ukraine.
Exactly.
In terms of just like, you see people farming in the movies that are about it, and you know that there were farms, but they weren't allowed to eat that food. That food was not theirs.
Yes, correct. Exactly. And the people, I mean, would stand in like these all-night bread lines just for something that could keep them nourished enough so that they didn't die from day to day. But obviously it wasn't even, I mean, there were still so many people that lost their lives as a result of this. So it was definitely something that could have been better controlled had the people that were in control of it actually cared about the result of everything that was happening and didn't look at it from a political standpoint.
So when the famines are over, the time between the famines and World War II, what does that look like in Ukraine?
Basically, at that time, it was becoming very much Soviet state. They were getting rid of churches, just tearing them to the ground. A lot of, Ukraine is known for its monasteries, and it's typically been a Christian country over the years, but they've just kind of annihilated the churches. And then a lot of people ended up sent to gulags for, I guess, independent and nationalism movements that were talked about. There was also So if you go to Kiev, there's a place, and I'm not sure I'm going to say it's right, called Babi Yar, but it's a ravine, and you can visit it. It's in the city center, more or less, just right on the outs of it. And it's a ravine where basically if you had any ill notions towards the government, you were killed there. And then, of course, during World War II, that's where I think upwards of like 40,000 Jews lost their lives in that same spot. So it's a very, very like somber place in the middle of this beautiful and lively city that, eventually became Kiev. But so it was definitely some trying times. And then World War II, came about, and as bad as, everything that happened there, it kind of did bring the people together with a common goal. So I think that's kind of where things bounced out just a little bit and bounced back up. And then the economy lifted a little bit after the war as well.
What was it like to be in Kiev after the war, when the Cold War is starting? Do they assimilate into Soviet identity, or are they continually trying to keep their own identity? What is that like?
I think it's a bit of both. I think like when I talk to my Ukrainian friends today or my Russian friends, they all know and have family in both places. So if you talk to somebody who may have grown up in Kiev, their family might actually be from another place. So the ties did become a little bit closer. There were still some nationalistic movements behind the scenes, and every time those would kind of spark up a little bit, there was always something that would kind of squash them. Like in the 1970s, they tried to Russify the places a little bit more and get rid of the Ukrainian language. So that's kind of one thing that they were trying to do to keep people more engaged in Russian culture and being, part of the Russian identity, as opposed to coming into terms of being like their own nation in a way. So, I mean, there's definitely, became a science and tech hub as well, which you can still see evidence of that today. Ukrainians are really, really great at math and science, like exceptionally great, and they still take a lot of pride in it. But that was kind of their specialty. So every country in the Soviet Union had a specialty of its own, and Ukraine was science and tech. So, so I think that with that, you brought in a lot of people from other parts of the Soviet Union, and it just became a bit more diverse, I guess, in terms of national identity, with all these people coming in and living there. But it also, anytime there was a nationalistic movement, it was squashed before it could get too big.
So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that they tried to get rid of the Ukrainian language. This is one of those things that's so interesting to me because I studied Russian. I don't speak it, but I studied it, and I live in another Slavic-speaking country, which I also don't speak Bulgarian. But I know enough to know that they're very similar and very different. But Ukrainian and Russian are very, very close, but they have slightly different alphabets. They have different ways that things are transliterated into English, and they are technically different languages. So, for example, when I was on a bus and the bus driver and I could not communicate at all, I pulled out like a Russian sentence and was able to explain to him that I didn't know what he was saying either. And I was able to say that in Russian. He completely understood it. But Ukrainian is actually technically a different language. What did they do when they were trying to get rid of Ukrainian?
They basically pulled it out of schools. They pulled it out of books. I don't know how huge of an impact that has, immediately as somebody who didn't live there. But I imagine that, it was kind of something that they were looking forward to the future generations not having any Ukrainian. So, so apparently it was pulled out of a lot of schools. It was pulled out of a lot of books. And it was kind of not really I don't know if it was completely made official that Russian was the language, but I mean, even if you go to many parts of Ukraine today, it is still the default language. So whatever they did work. I mean, you have this entire country who changes their language, and the majority of them did speak Russian. So it's quite interesting how that can happen over, just like a century of time, in my opinion.
From an outside perspective, it almost seems like if you took everyone in Spain and told them they had to speak French, they'd be able to get by and do it. And a lot of them do speak French, but you're still taking away. So everyone on the outside might just be like, well, you can still all communicate, but at the same time on the inside, you're actually taking away part of their culture because culture and language are so intricately connected.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's why if you look at a map of Ukraine, And I'm mainly well traveled in the east, not as much in the west. And if you look at the map of Ukraine, the places where I've traveled, they all are Russian speaking. I've never ever really heard many people speak Ukrainian there. Nowadays, it's getting more common in Kiev, but I mean, anywhere else I've been, not at all. Which works for me in a way because I actually know a little bit of Russian, but I don't know Ukrainian. But the places I have not been, which are in the West and they border Europe, are all very Ukrainian. So it's really interesting dynamic when you look at the entire country as a whole and see like where they were able to hold on to the language and where they weren't. And it's pretty obvious, like when you look at a map, who had the influence when it came to the language.
It sounds like Kiev was actually probably a pretty good place to be if you had to live in the Soviet Union. But it was probably not the worst straw to draw. But how did it, as the Soviet Union collapses, how does Ukraine actually decide it's going to be independent and take its independence?
After so many years of corruption, not to get into something totally different, I think, with Chernobyl and everything happening around then, it kind of brought the people together into a way that made them realize, okay, like this is bigger than we are right now. We need to start taking charge. And of course, it was other countries that were able to get away from the Soviet Union a little bit sooner than Ukraine. Ukraine is a very large country when it comes to population compared to a lot of the others. But, it was like, I think they were part of the Soviet Union for about 58 years. And when they became independent, they didn't, it wasn't as much progress as some of the other countries. And I think that sometimes when you look at it as somebody from Ukraine, you want to be there too. And it didn't really necessarily work for them. And the corruption is just so deep rooted in this country. I mean, it is part of, unfortunately, I hate to say it's part of their identity. That's what they've been doing the last 100 years or so. And it's become such an ingrained part of who they are that they didn't really know how to function outside of it. And that's why whenever you see Ukraine in the news, it seems to be like a little bit of chaos and unpredictability and things like that, even today. But they're finding their feet. It's just taking a little bit longer, based on the population, the geographical location, and where they stand today. But yeah, I mean, they've had protest after protest in that region, and especially in Kiev, over the years.
So one of the things that I remember as a current event, but didn't know much about at the time, that's now almost a historic event because it happened in 2004, is the Orange Revolution. And that was the first big historic event that happened in Ukraine after they left the Soviet Union, where they were trying to figure out who they were going to be as a country. What was the Orange Revolution actually about, though?
So as soon as the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you had this massive protest right before the Orange Revolution. And it was trying to get rid of the current president at the time, Kuchma. I'm sure I didn't say that right. I apologize if anybody's listening to this. But his last name was Kuchma. And it was this big protest campaign. It was obviously corruption-based, as most of them are. And it took place on Maidan. And basically, it was just trying to get him out of office. That ended up transpiring eventually into similar but much larger scale protest under the Orange Revolution. And that was as a result of, there were two people running for office. So there were, and I might not say these right either. So there was Yushchenko, Viktor Yushchenko, and then there was also Viktor Yanukovych. And they were running against each other. And the government, there was favoring of voting towards Yanukovych. And however, the people had actually voted for the other guy. So that's kind of what happened. And the people revolted. Whatever. So this happened for a couple months. And eventually, Yanukovych was sworn in as the successor in 2010 because they did end up putting the other guy, Yushchenko, into office for that period of time. Still completely plagued by corruption. 2010 is where it really took off all these years later. This is quite after the Orange Revolution, but all kind of was a result of it. So when Yanukovych was sworn in as the successor, it was just a really rough time to be in Ukraine. There was the Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko. She was the previous Prime Minister. She was jailed basically during these years. She's from over in Dnipropetrovsk, and she was I mean, there's a lot of things that go back and forth with her. She's known for corruption, but she also is known for wanting a democracy. So it depends on who you ask of what their opinion is on her, just like anybody. But yeah, so that kind of is how everything kind of trailed out. And then that ended up leading into what we know now is like Euromaidan or Maidan. And I actually visited Ukraine in 2011, a couple years prior to the current situation there in Maidan. And I can tell you right now, I've never seen a country with such transformation anywhere as I've seen as a result of this revolution in Ukraine. So it's, everything kind of just fed into the next thing. So when we talk about the Orange Revolution, it may have only lasted a couple months, but I mean, that's still, the effects of that are still what's happening today, based on the people involved.
And can you explain what Maidan is?
Okay, so Maidan means square. And my Ukrainian and Russian is not very good. This is a Ukrainian word, but it's basically a square called Independence Square, and it's in the center of Kiev. And this is where a lot of these protests take place. And the latest one, Euromaidan, took place at this square, and they just called it Maidan or Euromaidan. So if you just say Maidan, everybody will know what you're talking about. But it's just the square that it all took place at is kind of where the revolutions always take place. So it is this massive square, like it's just very, very, it's very beautiful. It's lit up at night, but it's in the center of Kiev off of Kreshchatyk Avenue. And it's where there's concerts, there's things, but most importantly, there's protests there. And this is where a lot of demonstrations take place. So it's always the heart of everything that's going on in Kiev.
Now, what actually was the result of those protests? I know we're still seeing them, but.
Yeah, it's, so, I mean, it's actually really interesting. I was back there this year in February, and it was the anniversary of the bloodiest day of Maidan, where 100 people were killed. So basically what happened is it was at the end of 2013. There was a Netflix documentary about this actually called Winter's on Fire, and it's talking about how everything kind of went down. And it's actually quite a good documentary. But yeah, I mean, it all started at the end of 2013, and it was just a protest against the guy who had come into office, Yanukovych, and he was just corrupt from, he was pulling ties from Europe and trying to swing them back towards Russia. So what kind of, happened was they suspended a signing of an association agreement with the EU. That was part of his doing because he wanted to keep his ties closer to Russia. And people came out to the square to protest at the end of 2013. It was in November. And the protests went on for months and months. And they climaxed in February of 2014. And there was 3 days there, and 100 people were killed. I think it was including like 17 or 18 police officers as well. So that's kind of what, when we see on the media, that's what we think of for Maidan. But basically, the people were protesting corruption. Eventually, Yanukovych ended up fleeing the country, and it kind of left a window there of opportunity, and that's when Russia came into Crimea, and then obviously later into Donbass or Donetsk and Luhansk.
So one of the things that's interesting to me about Yanukovych fleeing is so local Ukrainians, people from Kiev, go to his palace and they swarm his palace. And what they're looking for are, evidence about what his life was like. They see it's completely this grand, insane place. He's got like a boat, like a full-size boat on a lake. But one of the things they find are these black papers that actually list Paul Manafort, and so part of Yanukovych fleeing is now part of the Mueller investigation in America, which is such an interesting. Because one of the reasons that Manafort is suspected of having Russian ties before any of this really happened was that he was he was a paid consultant to Yanukovych and trying to get him elected and explain to so he was one of his, he was Donald Trump's campaign manager, or chairman, but he had no political experience in America really for decades, but he was in charge of this Ukrainian presidential run. So, Americans might have heard Yanukovych's name, in our own news broadcast, which I just think is really interesting because how often does Ukrainian and American politics really collide like that?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I mean, I've had some friends who've actually visited his palace. On a side note, I never have, but I think they're still running tours through today. But yeah, it's really interesting that that's come to light, because it's everything that happens in Ukraine trickles down decades later. So, I mean, it's interesting knowing that we're going to be still talking about this, 20 years from now. And it's something that you never think directly affects you as an American, but yeah.
Yeah, it does. Like, actually, Yanukovych's political campaign has, whatever political side you were on in America,
Yep.
his campaign has directly affected American politics and your life. And that is just, it's difficult to wrap your head around. Like, it's difficult for me to think about. Like,
it's a bit mind-boggling.
Yeah, this guy getting run out in Ukraine leads to the discovery of evidence that whatever side you're on has affected a political investigation, like, of a presidency. Like, that's a lot to think about.
It is, and it really shows how little we know as, like, everyday citizens. I mean, like, I travel to Ukraine because I like it and I have fun there. And I know, what's going on a bit, but I don't know, the full depth of anything because I didn't grow up there. And politics is something I do sometimes shy away a little bit from, because as somebody who is American, I grew up in a very different world. And, without really researching and getting to know the people of a country, I'm not a person to judge their belief system or what they think about things. So it's a very, very different, environment and climate in Ukraine when it comes to politics than it is in the United States. But it's all intertwined somehow. So it's really fascinating.
So after Yanukovych leaves, Russia comes in and fills in the void. And what does that actually look like on the ground?
Not pretty. It's still not pretty. And it's actually, everybody has their different opinion about it. But I think it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Just personally, but it's not pretty. And, the areas that they came into are very sensitive areas anyway. When you look at Crimea, you look at its history doesn't necessarily align with Ukraine and the empires they kind of have fallen under. So, it was that little like gap of vulnerability where somebody can just, come in and take over a very vulnerable area. And the people around are very vulnerable too, because they've never really had a huge identity for so much of their existence. So, with Crimea, it's a different situation. You go over to Donbass area, and that's exactly a similar situation, just with different demographics. It's a very, very, very sticky situation. I have friends who have come from Donbass and moved to Kiev. They're very pro-Ukrainian, but then I also know people that have stayed in the region, and they're completely fine being part of Russia. So it's something that I keep, I keep my opinions at bay with all of that, and I try not to get too involved with it, because I do see both sides of things, even if I, have a belief one way or another. But it's not pretty, and it's a lot of deaths there.
Yeah, so there was a lot of deaths, and technically Ukraine and Russia, are they still? I think they're technically still at war, which is. I don't even know how many people outside of the area realize that Ukraine and Russia went to war.
And that's what's scary, is that nobody knows that it even happened in the first place on a grand scale. We saw like a plane get shot down, so it kind of, brought attention to the region, but people never really took it seriously. Nobody really ever got involved for the better of anything. I'm not saying that there needed to be, foreign involvement in it, but it is a huge deal, and it's kind of one of those wars that there's just not really an end in sight, and it's very scary, and it's very scary for all the people that are involved in it. And I know every single Ukrainian I know somebody who has died in this war, so it's really, really frightful, and the fact that like it's getting such little attention on a bigger scale is very scary, I think.
So because of the war, I think a lot of people think Ukraine, they might probably don't know a lot about the war. They maybe not even know that it's happening exactly, but I do think it is changed the reputation of Ukraine in terms of a scary place to travel. But that's not really true, because the war is pretty localized to some places. So what would you say so let's start with Kiev. What are your best Kiev travel tips? And then what parts of Ukraine are completely safe to travel, and where would someone want to avoid traveling right now?
I would say that every single place in Ukraine outside of Donbass area, and I'm not 100% sure about Crimea. I think that it's safe enough, but it's the problem is getting there. And then you get certain stamps in your passport and you can never come back to Ukraine. I don't think that there's anything on the ground there currently, but I could be mistaken. It's every day is changing. But I think if you're anywhere in the Donbass region, which is just in the far east around Donetsk and Luhansk, that's a danger zone. That's not a place you want to be. But anywhere else, even right outside of that, you're fine. I mean, I've been to Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro, sorry. The Ukrainians listening to this, they changed the name. Kryvyi Rog, Kherson, everything was fine. Never felt endangered at all with what was going on in the ground, on ground in nearby areas. So it's just a matter of knowing where you're going, and you need a visa to get into these regions anyway, or you need permission. So it's not a place that you're going to accidentally walk into.
And I don't think we've actually talked about this on this show, but there are places in the world, and Crimea right now is one of them, where because of political disputes, you might be able to get there, but it will change the rules about where you're able to go later. So, for example, there's a disputed territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and if you go there, you can never go back to Azerbaijan. You can't, because you'll have been considered that you have broken their visa rules, and it's against the law to go there, and so you can never go there. Or the way that Israel is viewed by, if you want to go to some, not all, but some Arabic states, you should go with a passport that does not have an Israeli stamp, so that so this part of Ukraine, if you go there and if you feel like you really need to go there, and you can get in, that's fine, but you will never be allowed to go to Ukraine again.
Yeah, and it actually was proved for real. Like, I mean, there's a speculation behind things, but I mean, when Ukraine held Eurovision, the Russian winner who was representing Russia had been to Crimea, and they did not let her compete in the competition. So it is a real thing. I mean, people can go test it out and think they're living on the edge and they're super dangerous and stuff, but I mean, it's for real. So it's a really, really hairy situation. It's not one that, I mean, unless you have a reason to be in Crimea, I think right now it's better just to stay away. I mean, as beautiful as it is, it's one of my dream places to go to, but I'm not looking to go there. I actually was supposed to go in 2014, and everything went a little bit awry then. So, yeah. So
let's talk about the city of Kiev. When I was there, it was right before Eurovision. Mm-hmm. So I think it was extra beautiful in terms of, like, they were really working on cleaning up the city, but it's a really beautiful city. Yeah. It was very green because it's in May. It's
gorgeous. I mean, it is hands down my favorite place in the world. I don't know why, but I was like, I've been to quite a few countries, and there's only one country or one city really that gives me butterflies in my stomach when I am flying there, and it is Kiev. And I think it's just because it's just ever changing. And I've seen it go from one type of a city to another. And I'm not saying all the changes have been positive. There's a lot of issues. I mean, the currency there is bad. It's really bad. And I'm so tired of seeing travelers go there and calling it cheap, because it is cheap for us. Yes, it's not cheap for locals. And to like constantly reiterate that is hard, because the people are still living a very tough life there. But there's just something just so special about that city that just gives me like butterflies when I'm en route to go there. And it's really bad, because when I do travel there, I refuse to spend too long there, because I get very complacent, and I'm just like going out and spending money every day. And so I go to another city somewhere else that, for a couple days here and there, and explore a different part of Ukraine. And then I come back, and it just, I just love it. It's got such an energy about it.
What are some places that people wouldn't know?
The time you were there.
Oh, sorry. What are some places that people wouldn't know to go that maybe aren't on the list of places but you would suggest they go?
Okay, so I'm really, really big on supporting local businesses when I travel. And one thing and this might not, be everybody's cup of tea, or I should say maybe a glass of beer, but I really think it's important to support local businesses. There's a lot of really, really cool independent coffee shops and independent breweries that are opening up there. And while this might not seem very significant to most people, during the Soviet times, you could not be an entrepreneur easily. It was a very difficult thing, and you had to have special permission. And it was mainly reserved for people that were artists or actors and things like that. You couldn't just open up a brewery brewery. So nowadays you're seeing this like fire lit under people. And yeah, so it's basically, you know, when you see these people that are like my age or younger, opening up their own breweries or their own cafes or designer labels, you know that it's probably a very tough thing for them to really go down that path because they probably don't have the full support of maybe their elders and their parents, only because, you know, they grew up in a different time where it was very much about security and not taking chances in entrepreneurship. So I think that it might not be, you know, on everybody's radar to go look and hunt down these businesses, but I think it's just as important as going and seeing a statue or a church, in my opinion, because that is kind of, you're seeing the new Ukraine and you're seeing where it's heading. And I think it's really important to support that, even if it's not the thing that's at the top of your mind.
Do you have one of your coffee guides to Kiev?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll link to it in the show notes. So where can people find you?
You can find me at my blog, meganstar.com, or I guess social media. However, I'm starting to kind of shy away from social media a bit these days, so I'm not as responsive. But you can find me on Instagram at Megan Starr, and I'm usually updating stories, but never my feed. Yeah, so you can find me at those two places. You can shoot me an email if you're interested in Ukraine, or if you want to refute anything I said. I would love for you to give me more information or your opinion on things. That would be really great to hear, because, you know, it's an always changing environment, and I really like hearing other people's opinions on things.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for joining us and battling the Wi-Fi in Kazakhstan to talk with us.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I'm so sorry that this did take quite a few takes. And if there is background noise, I am very sorry, everybody. And there was Bon Jovi in the background at some point, so I hope somebody was really excited about that.
Well, thank you so much. And besides Ukraine, which I feel like I need to go back to, I am looking forward to getting more Kazakhstan travel tips from you down the road.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to giving them to you. Have a great day, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Bye, Megan.